She was there before the flashbulbs became a permanent noon. She was there when the kitchen floor in Gary, Indiana, was the only stage that mattered, its linoleum worn smooth by the frantic, desperate choreography of 5 young boys who danced not for applause but for survival. Her name was Katherine, a woman of soft-spoken words and unyielding, ironclad conviction, a mother who carried the weight of a heavy ancestral sorrow and wrapped it in the armor of a devout faith. For decades, the public narrative surrounding the architects of the Jackson family dynasty pointed its accusing finger solely at Joseph, the towering, terrifying patriarch whose leather strap and unblinking gaze became synonymous with the brutal cost of American stardom. We have been told the story of the father who stood by the window, a belt in his hand, commanding his children to bleed rhythm. But when psychologists, biographers, and those close to the family began to peel back the layers of that cramped, 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street, they uncovered a far more complex, symbiotic, and deeply unsettling psychological machinery. They found that Joseph was only half of the equation. Beneath the quiet maternal grace of Katherine Jackson lay a subtle, absolute system of emotional governance, a quiet rule that laid the foundation for the most tragic psychological fracture in the history of modern pop culture. To understand the adult who would eventually build a literal fortress of childhood called Neverland, one must look past the loud violence of the father and look into the soft, stifling silence of the mother. In the field of developmental psychology, there is a phenomenon known as the invisible tether, where a parent's emotional survival becomes entirely dependent on the compliance and perfection of the child. Katherine Jackson did not use a leather strap, but she wielded something far more potent, an absolute conditional love tied to spiritual purity and familial loyalty. She was a woman who had been broken by the world long before her children were born, crippled by polio as a child, trapped in a volatile, unfaithful marriage with a man she could neither control nor leave. Katherine sought refuge in the strict apocalyptic theology of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The world outside the walls of 2300 Jackson Street was not just dangerous, it was actively demonic, an existential threat that would chew her children up and spit them into eternal damnation. Inside those walls, she created a sanctuary that was also a psychological panopticon. A young Michael Jackson, hypersensitive and profoundly empathetic, did not just observe his mother's pain, he inhaled it. He became her emotional caretaker, a child tasked with the impossible burden of healing his mother's broken life through his own flawless obedience. The psychological analysis of Michael's early childhood reveals a dark, unspoken secret about the nature of his trauma. While Joseph broke his body, Katherine captured his soul. In the quiet hours of the Gary evenings, when Joseph was away working at the steel mill or pursuing his own vices, Katherine would gather the children to study the scriptures. She painted a vivid, terrifying portrait of a world on the brink of destruction, a world where any misstep, any independent thought, or any indulgence in secular desires would result in total abandonment by God and family. For a child as imaginative and porous as Michael, this was not mere religious instruction. It was an existential terror that mapped directly onto his developing mind. He began to view his own natural human impulses, his desire to play, his emerging autonomy, his very identity outside of the collective family unit as inherently evil. Psychologists refer to this as a fragmented self-concept, where a child splits their identity into the good, performing self that earns the mother's approval, and the bad, authentic self that must be hidden away in the deepest dark of the subconscious. Michael learned early that to be loved by Katherine, he had to remain a blank canvas, an eternal infant who existed only to fulfill her spiritual and emotional needs. The domestic landscape of that Gary home was a pressure cooker masquerading as a normal household. The house itself was tiny, a mere 800 square feet, a space so compressed that privacy was a physical impossibility. In that dense, claustrophobic environment, emotions traveled like electricity through standing water. When Joseph's rage erupted, Katherine did not always intervene. Instead, her weapon of choice was a devastating holy withdrawal. If a child stepped out of line, she would retreat into a cold, pious disappointment that was far more agonizing to Michael than any physical blow. He would crawl to her, begging for forgiveness, terrified of the silence that felt like the end of the world. This created an intense pathological attachment style known as anxious ambivalent. Michael became obsessed with maintaining her gaze, obsessed with ensuring she was pleased. He watched her face for the slightest shift in expression, reading the lines around her mouth, the subtle dropping of her shoulders, learning to calibrate his entire existence to keep her steady. The dark secret of Katherine's rule was that she used her own victimization as a tool of absolute control. By being the victim of Joseph's brutality and the world's cruelty, she became untouchable, an idol of suffering that her children could never defy without feeling an overwhelming, paralyzing sense of guilt. As the Jackson Five began their meteoric rise, moving from the smoky, dangerous talent shows of the Midwest to the pristine, artificial light of Motown in Los Angeles, the psychological dynamics of the family did not change. They merely scaled up. When they moved into Havenhurst, the grand estate in Encino, Katherine maintained her role as the moral anchor and the ultimate arbiter of her children's inner lives. By this time, Michael was no longer just a son. He was the primary economic engine of an entire clan. Yet inside his mind, he remained the terrified little boy on Jackson Street. The transition to global fame exacerbated the split within his psyche. Out on stage, under the blinding warmth of the spotlight, he was a god, a master of space and time who commanded the adoration of millions. But the moment he stepped off that stage and walked into Havenhurst, he was forced back into the rigid, infantilizing box his mother had constructed. Katherine resisted his growth at every turn. To her, Michael's maturation was a direct threat to the sanctuary she had built, a sign that the corrupting influence of the world was finally infiltrating her holy ground. She kept him financially, logistically, and emotionally dependent on her, discouraging friendships outside the family and viewing any attempt at romantic intimacy as a betrayal of her love and a violation of their faith. This constant, unnatural suppression created a profound state of arrested development. Psychologists who studied Michael's later life point back to these Encino years as the period where the damage became irreversible. He was caught in a cruel psychological pincer movement. On one side stood Joseph, demanding relentless masculine perfection and treating him like a prized racehorse. On the other side stood Katherine, demanding eternal childhood, spiritual purity, and absolute devotion to her emotional well-being. To survive this impossible duality, Michael did the only thing his mind could manage. He stopped growing up. He began to romanticize the very concept of childhood, because it was the only period of his life where he felt he had a legitimate claim to his mother's uncorrupted affection, before the money, before the fame, and before the heavy demands of the family business tore them apart. The dark reality was that Katherine's version of love required Michael to remain mutilated as a human being. He could not be a man, he could not be a husband, and he could not be an independent agent. He had to remain Katherine's miraculous golden child, the boy who would redeem her life of sorrow. By the early 1980s, as the thriller era loomed and Michael became the most famous human being on the planet, the cracks in this psychological foundation began to widen into chasms. The world saw a young man at the absolute peak of his powers, a cultural phenomenon who broke racial barriers and redefined the entertainment industry. But behind the closed doors of his private quarters, Michael was a ghost inhabiting a crowded house. He began to fast obsessively, dropping his weight to dangerous levels, a classic psychological manifestation of a desire to disappear, to shrink himself down so he would take up less space, a behavior deeply linked to control over a body that had been commodified by everyone around him, including his mother. He began his first tentative steps into plastic surgery, a physical manifestation of his profound desire to erase the face that Joseph mocked, but also to erase the biological heritage that tied him to the family system. Yet, even as he altered his features, he chose to look more like Katherine. He adopted her soft eyes, her gentle smile, transforming his own countenance into a mirror image of the woman who held his soul captive. It was a tragic, desperate attempt to internalize her, to ensure that no matter how far he ran or how famous he became, he would always see her approval when he looked in the mirror. The ultimate manifestation of Katherine's psychological legacy was the creation of Neverland Ranch. Built in the late 1980s, Neverland was not merely a rich man's playground or an eccentric whim. It was a physical, geographic externalization of Michael Jackson's broken inner child. It was a direct subconscious recreation of the sanctuary Katherine had promised, but could never truly provide. In Neverland, time was suspended. There were amusement park rides that ran all night, a movie theater that served endless candy, and an abundance of exotic animals, a world entirely isolated from the harsh, demanding reality of adult responsibility and adult cruelty. But most importantly, it was a world where Michael could finally be the mother he never had, and the child he was never allowed to be. He filled the ranch with children, not out of the malicious intent the world later accused him of, but out of a deep pathological compulsion to recreate a pure, uncorrupted family unit where love was unconditional and the outside world could never intrude. He was trying to build a better Gary, Indiana. He was trying to rewrite history, acting as a protective maternal figure to the world's lonely children, trying desperately to heal his own profound isolation through them. But you cannot build a fortress strong enough to keep out the ghosts of your childhood. The very mechanisms Michael used to escape his trauma eventually became the weapons the world used to destroy him. The isolation, the refusal to engage with adult reality, the desperate, naive belief that innocence alone could shield him from malice, all of these traits were cultivated under Katherine's quiet, absolute rule. When the allegations first surfaced in 1993, Michael's world shattered. The public, which had once worshipped him, turned on him with a feral intensity. And in that moment of supreme crisis, when he needed a fierce, protective advocate to stand between him and the wolves, the family system did what it had always done. It looked to see how the crisis would affect the collective brand and the collective income. Katherine, wrapped in her quiet dignity and her unyielding faith, offered prayers and soft words of comfort, but she remained passive, trapped in her own lifelong pattern of survival through withdrawal. She could not save him from the world because she had spent his entire life teaching him that the world was an unstoppable, destructive force that would inevitably destroy them all. The legal and social battlefields of the mid-90s did not just expose Michael Jackson to the harsh glare of global scrutiny. They tore open the psychological scar tissue that had never properly healed since his days in Gary. As prosecutors and tabloids dissected his life, looking at his friendships with children through a lens of profound cynicism, Michael retreated further into the dark, protective womb of his mother's philosophy. To him, the world was finally proving Katherine right. The Armageddon she had warned him about during those long, humid Indiana evenings was no longer a distant theological concept. It was happening in real time, broadcast on CNN. The outside world was indeed a demonic, predatory entity designed to tear down the pure and the innocent. This realization brought with it a devastating paradox. While it drove him back into a state of total emotional dependence on Katherine, it also filled him with a deep, unspoken resentment. He had done everything she asked. He had remained pure in his own eyes. He had sustained the family. He had stayed close to her faith, and yet the sanctuary had failed to protect him. During this period, psychologists observing his behavior noted an escalation in what is known as defensive regression. When an individual faces an overwhelming existential threat that they lack the emotional tools to confront as an adult, their psyche retreats to the last chronological point where they felt safe. For Michael, that safe point was the absolute submission to maternal authority. Behind the closed doors of his changing residences, away from the lawyers and the shouting crowds, he would crawl into beds, curl into the fetal position, and weep for hours, often calling out for his mother. Yet, when Katherine arrived, the dynamic was not one of healthy adult comfort. It was a replication of the old, stifling routine. She would pray over him, reminding him that suffering was the lot of God's chosen people, effectively reframing his immense, agonizing trauma, not as something to be actively fought and healed through psychological intervention, but as a spiritual burden to be passively endured. This passive endurance was the ultimate trap. It prevented Michael from developing the psychological agency needed to defend his own boundaries, leaving him perpetually vulnerable to the handlers, doctors, and opportunists who were slowly circling his life. By the turn of the millennium, the financial and emotional weight of the entire Jackson apparatus had begun to crush whatever remained of Michael's autonomy. The family, which had grown exponentially in size and debt, still viewed him as the ultimate safety net. Psychologists who study high-net-worth family systems often identify a role known as the designated martyr, the single member who is unconsciously elected by the group to carry the emotional and financial dysfunctions of the collective. Michael accepted this role completely because Katherine's rule had taught him that his worth was entirely conditional upon his utility to the family. In the early 2000s, as his finances became dangerously precarious and his addiction to prescription medication deepened, his relationship with Katherine entered its final, most tragic phase. He began to isolate himself from her, not because he no longer loved her, but because the shame of his falling standard, his physical decay, and his reliance on narcotics made him feel unworthy of her gaze. He could not bear to see the quiet, holy disappointment in her eyes, the same disappointment that had terrified him as a 7-year-old boy in Gary Dot. This avoidance only intensified his internal isolation. He was a man who possessed everything and nothing, living in transient luxury, moving from country to country like a royal nomad, yet completely devoid of a central, grounding maternal presence that could offer unconditional shelter. The dark secret had fully matured. The quiet rule of Katherine had rendered him incapable of trusting anyone who did not demand his total submission, while simultaneously making him terrified of the one person whose submission he craved. When the second trial arrived in 2005, the physical transformation of Michael Jackson was complete. He appeared in court pale, skeletal, and ghost-like, a literal phantom of a man. His appearance in pajamas during one infamous court date was not merely a bizarre, eccentric choice. It was a profound psychological cry for help, a visual manifestation of a child being dragged out of bed to face an adult tribunal. Throughout that grueling trial, Katherine sat behind him, a stoic, silent sentinel in the courtroom. To the cameras, she was the picture of maternal loyalty. But to the psychological eye, she was the warden of the system that had brought him to this precipice, her very presence reminding him of the ultimate cost of failure. The acquittal in 2005 brought no relief, only a profound, hollow emptiness. The acquittal did not wash away the stain. It merely left him adrift in a world that had completely delegitimized his innocence. In the years leading up to 2009, the psychological machinery of his childhood reached its inevitable, fatal conclusion. The announcement of the This Is It concerts in London was a direct result of immense financial pressure from creditors and the lingering demands of a lifestyle built to sustain an empire. Michael knew his body could not endure the grueling schedule. He knew his mind was fractured beyond repair, yet he could not say no. To say no to the tour was to admit financial ruin, which meant failing the family, which ultimately meant failing Katherine. The ghost of Joseph still demanded the performance, but it was the internalized voice of Katherine that whispered that his failure would mean total abandonment. He turned to stronger and stronger chemicals to numb the agonizing reality of his existence, searching for a synthetic peace that his mind could no longer generate on its own. When the end came on that warm June day in 2009, it was not just a medical failure. It was the final, predictable collapse of a psychological structure that had been built on sand. The news of his death shattered the global landscape, triggering a wave of grief that revealed just how deeply his strange, tragic life had woven itself into the fabric of human culture. But as the world mourned the pop star, the family system immediately went to work restructuring itself around the new reality. In a move that shocked many but surprised no one familiar with the family's true dynamics, Michael's will left custody of his 3 children not to their mothers and not to any external guardian, but entirely to Katherine Jackson. Even in death, Michael could not break the invisible tether. He passed the care of his own children back into the hands of the very woman whose quiet, absolute rule had shaped his own undoing, ensuring that the psychological lineage would continue into the next generation. Looking back at this narrative through the contemporary lens of our current year, 2026, the legacy of Michael Jackson and the role of Katherine have undergone a profound cultural reassessment. Recent biopics, extensive investigative documentaries, and modern psychological studies into child stardom have moved past the simplistic, sensationalized villainy of Joseph Jackson. We have begun to understand that the most damaging psychological prisons are not built with walls of violence, but with walls of devotion. Katherine Jackson, now living in the deep twilight of her incredibly long life, remains an enigmatic, almost mythical figure, a matriarch who survived the steel mills of Gary, the madness of Hollywood, and the loss of her most famous son, all while maintaining her quiet, unyielding poise. But the modern world looks at her now with a mixture of immense respect and profound sorrow, recognizing the dark secret that lay beneath her gentle rule. Ultimately, the story of Michael Jackson's childhood is a haunting meditation on the fragility of the human spirit when caught between the twin forces of exceptional genius and pathological love. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about our own nature, that sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who are least equipped to let us survive. We are left with the image of a boy who changed the world with his dance but could never step out of the shadow of his own kitchen. His life remains a towering, melancholic monument to the unspoken truths of the human heart, a reminder that under the brightest lights, the deepest shadows are always the ones cast by the people who swear they are keeping us safe. The slow dismantling of the Jackson mythos has reached its final unvarnished chapter. As the family system faces the inevitable horizon of a world without its matriarch, the psychological architecture that took root in the 1960s is undergoing its ultimate stress test. For decades, the collective survival of the clan depended on maintaining a unified front, an unspoken pact that the family was a holy sanctuary and the outside world was the enemy. But as Katherine's active grip on the family's emotional center has faded with the passage of time, the long repressed truths have begun to bleed through the cracks, revealing that the sanctuary was always a beautifully adorned cage. Clinical psychologists studying the long-term effects of spiritual and maternal enmeshment note that the true crisis often occurs not during the height of the parent's rule, but during its twilight, when the dominant figure who demanded absolute compliance becomes silent. The individuals who were kept in a state of perpetual childhood are suddenly forced to confront an existential void. Without Katherine's quiet, organizing authority to tell them who they are, the remaining members of the older generation find themselves adrift, wrestling with a profound identity crisis. They are elderly children who have spent their entire lives performing for an audience of one, and now that the theater is emptying, the silence is deafening. This vacuum has allowed for a radical re-examination of Michael Jackson's relationship with his own children. Unlike Michael, who was forced to view his mother as an infallible deity, Prince, Paris, and Biggie have grown up with the psychological vocabulary necessary to name their reality. They have openly engaged with modern therapeutic frameworks, breaking the ancient family taboo against seeking mental health support outside the clan. By processing their grief and their father's complex legacy through professional therapy rather than passive spiritual endurance, they are effectively cauterizing the generational wound. They are proving that while trauma can be inherited like an heirloom, it can also be laid down by those brave enough to refuse its weight. The dark secret uncovered by the psychological dissection of Katherine's rule ultimately shatters the classic American fable of the self-made superstar. We are accustomed to stories of genius born out of raw ambition or forged in the fires of overt adversity. But Michael Jackson's genius was intricately bound to his submission. He was engineered from infancy to be an emotional antenna, tuned specifically to detect and alleviate the hidden pain of his mother. This hyper-attunement is what gave his music its piercing, universal emotional resonance. He was singing with the desperation of a child trying to keep his mother alive. The world reaped the beautiful, artistic rewards of this dynamic, while Michael paid the ultimate psychological price. As we stand in the present day, looking back across the vast, melancholic expanse of this American dynasty, the story of Katherine and Michael Jackson ceases to be a mere tabloid chronicle and becomes a universal parable. It is a story about the terrifying power of the maternal gaze, a force that can create a god on stage while simultaneously erasing the human being underneath. It challenges the romanticized notion that love, in its absolute and unyielding form, is always a healing force. It reveals that love, when weaponized by fear and wrapped in the armor of infallibility, can become an instrument of profound psychological subjugation. The lights of Neverland have long since gone dark, the stage crowds have gone home, and the frantic tapping of young loafers on linoleum has faded into history. What remains is a stark, lingering lesson about the sanctity of the individual human soul. The tragic majesty of Michael Jackson's life will forever be remembered, but the quiet rule that shaped him serves as a timeless monument to the unspoken truths of the human family, a reminder that the hardest prison to escape is always the one where the jailer is the person you love most in the world. The inheritance of trauma within the Jackson dynasty did not terminate with Michael's final breath. It merely mutated, wrapping itself around the lives of his 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. When Katherine took custody of the children in the summer of 2009, she was already an octogenarian, a woman whose worldview had been solidified by nearly a century of hardship, strict faith, and family tragedy. The children were removed from the isolated, surreal sanctuary of Neverland and the transient hotel suites of Michael's final years, and thrust directly into the old, familiar structure of the Encino estate. To the public, it looked like a reclamation, a return to stability under the loving gaze of the family matriarch. But to psychologists who specialize in intergenerational trauma, it was the reactivation of a historical loop. The children were now subject to the exact same psychological environment that had broken their father, an intense blend of absolute familial loyalty, deep isolation from the secular world, and the heavy, invisible burden of carrying the Jackson name. Paris Jackson, in particular, would bear the brunt of this psychological inheritance. As she entered her teenage years under Katherine's care, she began to exhibit the classic signs of a child caught in a generational pincer movement. She was highly sensitive, artistically gifted, and fiercely protective of her father's memory, traits that mirrored Michael's own youth. Yet inside the walls of Havenhurst, she found herself colliding with the same rigid religious expectations that had once suppressed her father's autonomy. Katherine, driven by an aging panic to save these children from the corrupt world that she believed had killed Michael, tightened the emotional reins. The internet, secular friendships, and modern teenage expressions were viewed through the old, apocalyptic lens of her Jehovah's Witness faith. For Paris, the pressure became unbearable. The conflict between her innate desire for self-expression and the crushing weight of her grandmother's quiet, conditional approval led to a profound psychological crisis, culminating in highly publicized struggles with mental health and suicide attempts in the early 2010s. It was a tragic modern echo of the same internal fracture Michael had suffered decades earlier, the authentic self screaming for release from the prison of the compliant self. As the years advanced toward the 2020s, the family system began to fray along its ancient fault lines. The absolute authority that Katherine had wielded for over half a century began to erode as her physical health declined. The world watched in bizarre fascination during the infamous 2012 family dispute, where Katherine briefly vanished to a spa in Arizona, leaving her grandchildren behind amidst a bitter public civil war between her adult children over Michael's estate. This event exposed the dark underbelly of the system Katherine had built. Without her central, absolute emotional governance, the family collapsed into a collection of competing factions, proving that the loyalty she had demanded for decades was not a natural bond, but a forced compliance maintained by her sheer will. The adult Jackson siblings, still trapped in their own arrested developments, scrambled for control of the matriarch, recognizing that whoever controlled Katherine controlled the remaining emotional and financial leverage of the empire. By the time the culture reached the mid-2020s, a profound shift in the collective understanding of child stardom and parental narcissism began to cast Katherine's legacy in an entirely new light. The long-held narrative that Joseph was the sole monster of the family story began to dissolve under the weight of retrospective analysis. In the current cultural landscape of 2026, as Hollywood prepares yet another wave of retrospective biopics and documentaries parsing the King of Pop's internal life, the focus has settled squarely on the quiet room where the mother sat. Modern psychologists analyzing Michael's extensive audio journals recorded during his life for his unwritten autobiography have highlighted how frequently his thoughts returned not to his father's belt, but to his mother's face. He spoke of her with an adoring, almost terrifying reverence, a devotion so total that it left no room for his own ego to exist. This is the dark secret that has finally come to light. Joseph's abuse was a visible enemy that Michael could hate, fight, and eventually flee. Katherine's love was an invisible fog that he could never escape, because to fight it was to become an enemy of goodness itself. Today, in 2026, Katherine Jackson exists as a silent, monumental relic of a bygone era of American culture, living out her final days sheltered from the very public she helped her family conquer. Her children and grandchildren have branched into their own lives, some finding a fragile peace through art and therapy, others remaining trapped in the perpetual loop of reality television and nostalgia tours. But the psychic architecture she built in that tiny house in Gary, Indiana, remains standing in the collective consciousness. It stands as a warning to a culture that routinely trades the psychological well-being of children for the glittering prize of exceptional achievement. We look at Michael Jackson now not just as a tragic entertainer, but as a victim of a beautifully gilded psychological cage, a boy who spent his entire life trying to sing his way back into a mother's unconditional embrace that never truly existed. In the end, the history of the Jackson family forces us to look into the mirror and ask ourselves about the true nature of protection. We are left with a lingering, philosophical ache, a realization that the most profound damages inflicted upon us are rarely the work of strangers or overt enemies. They are crafted in the quietest corners of our homes, spoken in gentle whispers, and wrapped in the holy vestments of love and devotion. The story of Catherine's rule is a testament to the fact that the human soul can survive almost any amount of hardship, but it cannot survive a love that demands its erasure. As the music of Michael Jackson continues to play across the world, standard and eternal, it carries within its rhythm the heartbeat of that lonely boy in Gary, still dancing on the linoleum, still watching the door, still hoping that if he performs perfectly enough, the silence will finally end. The public focus on the estate battles of the late 2010s and early 2020s revealed a deeper, more insidious reality about the system Katherine had constructed. It was designed to be immortal, but it was entirely unsustainable without its architect. As the matriarch advanced into her 90s, her physical withdrawal from the day-to-day management of the Jackson Empire mirrored the cold, holy withdrawal she had once used as a disciplinary tool in Gary. The family found themselves trapped in a psychological paradox. They had been raised to believe that the family unit was a sacred fortress against a demonic world, yet inside the fortress, there was no longer a central authority to validate their existence. The adult children, now entering their senior years, found themselves still reacting to the internalized voice of a mother who demanded perfection but offered no absolution. Psychological evaluations of individuals who grow up in high-intensity, religiously isolated family systems show a distinct pattern of competitive victimization. When love is scarce and conditional, siblings do not learn to form healthy alliances. Instead, they compete for the limited emotional resources of the dominant parent. In the Jackson family, this competition manifested as a lifelong struggle for Katherine's favor, which was inextricably linked to the control of Michael's legacy. Even as late as 2024 and 2025, legal filings and public disputes between family members over the administration of the Michael Jackson estate were couched in the language of protecting Katherine. The tragic irony, as noted by contemporary family therapists, was that they were not protecting her. They were still trying to win her approval, still trying to prove that they were the loyal, righteous child who deserved to be seen. Michael's children, however, began to break the cycle by doing something their father was never permitted to do. They sought truth outside the family mythos. Prince and Paris, entering their late 20s by 2026, began to publicly carve out identities that, while respectful of their father's memory, completely rejected the rigid, isolating orthodoxy of the Jackson family system. Paris's artistic evolution became a public form of therapy. Her music and her public persona embraced the raw, messy, and imperfect realities of human experience, a direct rebellion against the sanitized, pristine image that Katherine had demanded of her children. By choosing to be authentic rather than compliant, Michael's children began the slow, painful process of dismantling the invisible panopticon that had held their father captive for 50 years. The dark secret of Katherine's rule is ultimately a lesson in the mechanics of spiritual and emotional enmeshment. Enmeshment occurs when the boundaries between a parent and a child become so blurred that the child cannot distinguish their own desires, fears, and identity from those of the parent. Michael Jackson did not know where Katherine ended, and he began. When he sang with her voice. When he hurt, he carried her sorrow. When he altered his face, he sculpted her features onto his skin. This level of psychological erasure is a form of trauma that leaves no visible scars, making it nearly impossible for the victim to seek help. To admit that the mother's love is destructive is to destroy the self entirely, a psychological suicide that Michael's ego could never risk. In the current cultural retrospective of 2026, we are finally afforded the distance necessary to view this narrative with clear-eyed compassion. We see Katherine Jackson not as a calculating villain, but as a deeply traumatized woman of her time, a woman who used the only tools she had, faith, maternal authority, and absolute isolation, to protect her children from a racist, predatory world that she fully believed would destroy them. Her tragedy is that her protection became a prison. Her failure was not a lack of love, but a love so fierce and possessive that it choked the air out of the room, leaving her most gifted son to spend his life suffocating under the weight of her devotion. The legacy of this psychological machinery remains etched into every note of Michael Jackson's music. When we listen to the desperate, driving rhythm of his greatest works, we are listening to the sound of a boy running from a shadow he can never outrun. We are listening to a profound, beautiful, and terrifying monument to the human cost of conditional love. The kitchen floor in Gary is empty now. The estate in Encino stands as a silent museum to an empire of ghosts, and the world has moved on to new idols. But the story of the quiet rule that shaped the king of pop remains a haunting reminder that the most dangerous cages are always the ones built out of love.